53 years of life had come and gone, leaving Marianne with a deep sense of routine and a quieter loneliness she seldom acknowledged. Her days were predictable. Wake up, sip her coffee while watching the morning news, work her shifts at the local library, then return to her small home to read or tinker with a hobby she'd lost interest in years ago. It wasn't that her life was bad. It was just small, confined, and carefully managed to avoid disappointment. On a Tuesday afternoon, she ventured out to the grocery store, her mind preoccupied with her list: milk, bread, vegetables, coffee filters. The mundane tasks had become her anchor, something to focus on when the silence of her life felt too loud. She wasn't expecting anything unusual, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. In the produce section, as she reached for a bundle of kale, her hand brushed against someone else's. She pulled back quickly, looking up to apologize, and was met with the warmest pair of eyes she'd ever seen. "Sorry about that," he said, flashing a smile that made her stomach flutter, a sensation she hadn't felt in years. "Oh no, it's my fault," she stammered, clutching her cart for support. The man looked to be in his early 30s, his face lit with an easy confidence. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and his casual jeans and hoodie gave him an approachable air. Marianne felt acutely aware of the lines on her face, the graying strands at her temples. He held up the kale with a grin. "Guess it's popular today." She laughed nervously. Apparently, to her surprise, he lingered. They chatted briefly about cooking greens, a topic she hadn't imagined could sustain such an animated conversation. His name, she learned, was Ryan. He was new to town, having moved for work, and was still learning the ropes of adulting, as he put it with a chuckle. Something about him felt genuine, unguarded. As they talked, Marianne found herself smiling more than she had in weeks. When he finally moved on, she couldn't shake the way her chest felt lighter, as if a small crack of sunlight had broken through her carefully controlled gray skies. For the rest of her errands, her thoughts kept drifting back to Ryan, his smile, his kindness, and the strange, unexpected comfort she felt in his presence. Later that evening, as she unpacked her groceries, Marianne found herself laughing softly at the absurdity of it all. A man half her age had managed to make her feel seen in a way she hadn't in years, and it was utterly ridiculous. Still, as she sat down with her tea and a book that night, her mind wandered back to the grocery store. For the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to daydream. It was foolish, yes, but in that moment, it was enough to make her heart feel just a little less lonely. Marianne didn't expect to see Ryan again. Their brief encounter in the grocery store had been a fluke, a pleasant moment in an otherwise predictable life. But the universe, as it turned out, wasn't finished with her yet. A week later, she was back at the same store, standing indecisively in front of a row of canned soups, when a familiar voice startled her. Still deciding on dinner, she turned, her cheeks flushing as she met Ryan's playful gaze. He was holding a carton of almond milk and a bag of apples. "Oh, you again," she said, trying to keep her voice light. "I suppose you're going to lecture me on the superiority of fresh soup over canned." He grinned. "Only if you're up for a spirited debate." Before she knew it, they were walking the aisles together, their carts side by side. Ryan had a knack for drawing her into conversation, his enthusiasm turning the most mundane topics, like the merits of various pasta shapes, into something engaging. By the time they reached the checkout line, Marianne felt more alive than she had in years. It was strange, this connection with a man so much younger than her, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt easy. "Do you ever go to the farmer's market?" he asked as they bagged their groceries. "I haven't in a while," she admitted. "You should. It's amazing. I'll be there this Saturday morning if you want to check it out." She hesitated, caught off guard by the invitation. It wasn't a date, she told herself. Just two people who had happened to meet at the grocery store. "I might," she said, her voice cautious. "Great. I'll keep an eye out for you," Ryan said, flashing her another of those disarming smiles before heading toward his car. Marianne stood there for a moment, clutching her bags, feeling a warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing. That Saturday, she found herself at the farmer's market, her stomach a knot of nerves. She almost turned back twice, telling herself it was silly to be here, but before she could leave, she spotted him. Ryan was standing by a booth of fresh flowers, examining a bouquet of sunflowers. When he saw her, his face lit up, You made it, he said, walking over. I was beginning to think I'd scared you off. Marianne laughed, shaking her head. I don't scare that easily. They spent the morning wandering through the stalls, sampling jams and cheeses, laughing at a street performer's antics. Ryan's energy was infectious, pulling Marianne out of her usual reserve shell. By the time they said goodbye, exchanging numbers with the casual ease of new friends, Marianne realized she hadn't felt this happy in years. That night, as she replayed the day's events in her mind, she couldn't help but smile. Ryan had brought something into her life that she hadn't even known was missing. A spark of joy, a reminder that connections could form in the most unexpected places. She still didn't understand why he seemed so interested in spending time with her, but for now she decided not to question it. For the first time in a long while, she was content to simply let things unfold. Weeks passed, and Ryan became a regular presence in Marianne's life. Their friendship unfolded naturally, each interaction leaving her feeling more energized and alive. They exchanged texts about everything from books and recipes to the strange quirks of life in their small town. Occasionally, they met for coffee or wandered the park, their conversations flowing effortlessly. For Marianne, it was like rediscovering a part of herself she thought had vanished years ago. But it wasn't until one particular evening that she realized just how much Ryan had come to mean to her. They had decided to meet at the local botanical garden, a quiet, tucked-away gem that Marianne had always loved. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the garden's lights flickered to life, illuminating the pathways in a soft golden glow. Ryan arrived with his usual casual charm, a plaid scarf slung over his neck and an easy smile. I brought something for us, he said, holding up a thermos. Hot chocolate, she guessed, grinning. Clothes, mulled cider, he replied, pouring her a cup as they settled onto a bench beneath an archway of twinkling lights. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping the warm, spiced drink. The evening air was cool, the garden alive with the faint rustle of leaves and the scent of blooming flowers. Thanks for suggesting this, Ryan said, his voice thoughtful. It's been a long week and I needed this. Marianne turned to him, her heart softening. Me too, she admitted. This place, it's always felt like an escape. An escape from what? He asked, his gaze steady. She hesitated, unsure of how much to share. But Ryan's presence had a way of putting her at ease. From feeling invisible, she said finally, the words surprising even herself. It's silly, I know. But sometimes, I feel like I've spent so much of my life just fading into the background. Ryan shook his head. That's not silly at all. But for what it's worth, I don't think you could ever be invisible. His words caught her off guard, a warmth spreading through her chest. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw something in his expression. Kindness, admiration, something deeper that she dared not name. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She cared for him, more than as a friend, more than she had any right to. Her breath caught, panic creeping in alongside the warmth. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was younger, vibrant, with his whole life ahead of him. And she was... Marianne! Ryan's voice pulled her back to the moment. You okay? She forced a smile, nodding. Yes, sorry. Just lost in thought. As they finished their cider and began walking back to the parking lot, Marianne's mind swirled with questions she wasn't ready to answer. Could this be more than friendship? Did she even dare to let herself hope for something more? As Ryan hugged her goodbye, his embrace lingering just a fraction longer than usual, Marianne's heart gave an undeniable leap. The truth was unavoidable now. This wasn't just a passing infatuation. Something had shifted, something she couldn't ignore. And it terrified her. Marianne spent the next few days caught in a whirlwind of emotions, her mind a battlefield of doubt and longing. How could this be happening? At her age, she thought she'd seen everything love had to offer. The excitement of youth, the comfort of companionship, the ache of heartbreak. But this? Falling for a man nearly 20 years her junior? It was absurd. Yet every time she tried to dismiss her feelings as foolish, Ryan's face would appear in her mind. His laugh, his warmth, the way he looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. All of it left her breathless. But with the joy came the fear. What would people say? Her neighbors, her colleagues at the library. What would they think of her, a woman in her 50s? entertaining such feelings for someone so much younger. She could almost hear the whispers, feel the judgment pressing down on her. And then there was Ryan himself. What if she misread his intentions? What if he saw her as nothing more than a friend, or worse, a fleeting novelty? One evening, as she sat alone in her kitchen, the soft hum of the radio filling the silence, Marianne opened her journal for the first time in years. Writing had always been her way of untangling the chaos in her mind, and tonight, the pages seemed to call to her. She began to write, pouring out her thoughts in a candid stream. Why now? Why him? I feel so alive when I'm with him, but it's terrifying. This kind of love isn't supposed to happen at my age. Is it even love? Or am I just clinging to the attention? The way he makes me feel young again. The tears came then, soft and unbidden. She wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable, this exposed, even to herself. But as the days passed, something began to shift. Amid the turmoil, a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered words she hadn't allowed herself to believe. Why not? Why shouldn't she feel this way? Why should love be confined to a certain age, a certain image? Life was fleeting. She knew that better than most. And wasn't it better to risk feeling everything, even the pain, than to retreat into the safety of nothing at all? The next time she saw Ryan, her heart felt lighter, though the undercurrent of uncertainty remained. They met for coffee at a cozy cafe, the kind with mismatched furniture and soft jazz playing in the background. Ryan greeted her with his usual enthusiasm, sliding into the seat across from her. You've been quiet this week, he said, his brow furrowing slightly. Just busy, she replied, offering a small smile. As they talked, Marianne found herself studying him. The way his hands moved as he spoke, the crinkle of his eyes when he laughed. Her chest tightened with a bittersweet ache. What about you? She asked, trying to shift the focus. How's work? Ryan shrugged. Same old. Honestly, my favorite part of the week was knowing I'd get to see you today. His words hit her like a wave, both exhilarating and terrifying. Before she could overthink it, she took a deep breath and said, Ryan, can I ask you something? Of course, he said, his expression open and genuine. Why do you spend so much time with me? I mean, I'm flattered, but you could be hanging out with people your own age. He tilted his head, considering her words. Then, with a soft smile, he said, Because you're interesting. Because you get me in a way a lot of people don't. And because I like being around you, Marianne. Isn't that enough? Her heart swelled, his words cutting through her doubts like sunlight breaking through clouds. She didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this connection was something worth fighting for. Marianne couldn't shake Ryan's words from her mind. Because I like being around you. Isn't that enough? They echoed in her thoughts as she prepared dinner one evening, her small kitchen filled with the aroma of roasted vegetables and herbs. It had been years since she had cooked for anyone but herself. The thought struck her unexpectedly. What if she invited Ryan over? The idea thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. Was it too forward? Too presumptive? But the more she mulled it over, the more she realized she wanted to share a piece of her life with him. The next time they met, during a walk in the park, she worked up the courage to bring it up. I was thinking, she began, her voice casual, though her heart pounded in her chest. You've been introducing me to all your favorite places. Maybe it's time I returned the favor. Ryan looked at her curiously. Oh, what did you have in mind? Well, she said, glancing at him, I thought you might come over for dinner one evening. Nothing fancy, just a home-cooked meal. His face lit up, and her nerves eased slightly. That sounds amazing. I'd love to. They agreed on the following Saturday, and as the day approached, Marianne found herself both excited and anxious. She spent the afternoon cleaning her modest home, fluffing pillows and rearranging bookshelves, second-guessing every small detail. She chose a menu that felt personal but not overly complicated. Roast chicken with rosemary, her mother's recipe for mashed potatoes, and a simple apple tart for dessert. Cooking had always been a comfort to her, a way to express care when words failed. When Ryan arrived, he carried a bottle of wine and a bouquet of wildflowers that made her heart skip a beat. These are beautiful, she said, her voice softer than she intended. I thought they'd suit you, he replied, his smile warm. She placed the flowers in a vase and led him into the dining room, where the table was set with her best dishes. They ate and talked for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. Marianne found herself laughing more than she had in years, her cheeks aching from smiling so much. Ryan was a natural storyteller, weaving tales of his travels and mishaps with a self-deprecating humor that left her in stitches. As the evening wound down, they moved to the living room, settling onto the couch with cups of tea. "This has been wonderful," Ryan said, looking at her with a sincerity that made her pulse quicken. "I'm glad you came," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, the unspoken feelings hovering just beneath the surface. Marianne's heart raced as she wondered if he felt it too. When Ryan reached out to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers brushing her cheek, she froze. Her breath hitched, her mind spinning with doubt and hope in equal measure. "Marianne," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. Her voice trembled as she replied, "Yes." But whatever he was about to say, he stopped himself, his hand falling back to his side. "Nothing. I'm really glad we met." The moment passed, but the unspoken words lingered, leaving Marianne with a bittersweet ache. As she saw him to the door and watched him disappear into the night, she leaned against the frame, her emotions a whirlwind. The lines between friendship and something more were blurring, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could be ignored. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to ignore them. The days after Ryan's visit seemed to stretch endlessly for Marianne. The house felt quieter somehow, as if his presence had infused the walls with a new kind of energy that now slowly faded. She couldn't help but replay every word they'd shared, every glance, every touch. His smile lingered in her mind, his warmth still present in the spaces between them. It was a Sunday evening when she found herself at the grocery store again, of all places, the same aisle where their story had started. The same soft hum of background music played, and the familiar rhythm of pushing the cart through aisles soothed her mind. But today something felt different. Her thoughts kept drifting to Ryan. She hadn't seen him since their dinner, and that ache, that undeniable pull, was becoming harder to ignore. As she rounded the corner, she nearly bumped into him. "Whoa, sorry," Ryan said, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, startled, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. There he was, standing before her with a mischievous glint in his eyes, as though he had just stepped out of her thoughts. "It's fine," she said, her heart suddenly beating faster. "I was just lost in thought." Ryan chuckled, stepping back to give her space. "Well, it's good to see you. Again." They stood there for a moment, a comfortable silence stretching between them. Marianne felt the pull of the familiar, the way he made her feel alive, important scene. "How's your week been?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Busy," Ryan replied. "But I've been thinking about you a lot, actually. About the other night." Marianne's breath caught in her throat. "Oh, yeah." He hesitated for a moment, looking at her in a way that made her heart skip. "It was really nice. You're easy to talk to, and I don't know. I just feel like there's something between us." Marianne's pulse quickened. The words were out in the open now, raw and real. She hadn't expected him to speak so plainly, so openly about his feelings. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable. And yet, there was a thrill in it, a pull she couldn't resist. "I feel the same," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan smiled, a gentle, reassuring expression. "Good. I wasn't sure if I was reading it wrong, or if you were just being kind." "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's not like that. She paused, unsure of how to continue. "I don't know what this means, Ryan. I'm not sure what to do with how I feel." His expression softened. "You don't have to have all the answers right away. I don't either. But I know that I want to see where this goes. We don't have to rush into anything."
"But
"I don't want to walk away either." The honesty in his words melted her hesitation just for a moment. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, and it was enough to quiet her doubts. "I don't either," she whispered. There was a pause, and then, without thinking, Marianne stepped closer to him. She could feel the warmth of his body near hers, his scent mixing with the air between them. The space between them was no longer just physical. It was emotional, raw, real. Without another word, Ryan leaned in, and she met him halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, testing the waters, but then it deepened, fueled by the longing that had been building between them for weeks. Marianne felt the world fall away, the mundane slipping into the background. In that kiss, she found something she had long forgotten. The feeling of being wanted, desired, seen in a way she never thought possible again. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Ryan rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted that for so long," he confessed, his voice hushed. Marianne could barely form words, her heart still racing. "I didn't know what I was afraid of until now." He smiled softly. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the store aisle, Marianne felt something shift in her, a release, a surrender. The fear wasn't gone, but it was no longer the driving force. What remained was the connection between them, something real, something she couldn't deny. And for the first time in a long time, Marianne allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't bound by the constraints of her age or the judgments of others. She let herself dream of the possibilities, of love, of companionship, of a life that still had room for surprises. Because in that moment, she knew there was one thing she didn't need to be afraid of anymore: love. The days that followed were a blur of emotions, each one deeper than the last. Marianne found herself navigating a world she hadn't expected to enter again, one filled with uncharted territory and exciting possibilities. Ryan's presence in her life was like a breath of fresh air, a spark of light in what had once been a shadowed existence. Their time together became more frequent. Walks in the park, dinners at her home, and late-night conversations that left them both feeling as if they were uncovering layers of each other that no one else had ever seen. But as the connection between them grew, so did Marianne's doubts. She couldn't help but wonder how long this would last. Ryan was young, and while he insisted that age didn't matter to him, a part of her couldn't ignore the voice in her head that wondered if she was simply a passing phase. She tried to push the thoughts aside, but they lingered, persistent and heavy. One evening, as they sat on her porch with glasses of wine, she turned to him, the question finally on her lips. "Ryan, do you really mean it? Do you truly think age doesn't matter?" Ryan looked at her with an intensity that made her heart flutter. He set his glass down, then reached for her hand. "I do mean it. Marianne, I've never been with someone who makes me feel like you do. I don't care about the number of years between us. What I care about is what we have right now." His words warmed her, but her heart still held a flicker of doubt. "But what about when I'm older? When you're still young and full of life and she trailed off, unsure of how to voice her fear. Ryan squeezed her hand. "We're not looking ahead to the future like it's a certainty, Marianne. We're living in the present. And right now, I want to be with you." His words were a balm to her worries, but they didn't completely erase them. Still, something shifted within her. Perhaps love wasn't about having all the answers. Perhaps it was about trusting the journey, no matter how uncertain it seemed. The next day, Marianne found herself reflecting on Ryan's words as she walked to the library where she worked. It was a quiet walk, and the crisp autumn air seemed to carry away some of the weight that had clung to her heart. She realized that she had been looking for guarantees in a world that offered none. There was no promise that love would last forever, no assurance that their bond wouldn't eventually fray. But wasn't that true for any relationship? What mattered was the connection they shared right now, the moments of joy, laughter, and tenderness. As the weeks went on, Marianne allowed herself to let go of her fears. She stopped worrying about what other people would think, stopped wondering if she was too old for this kind of love. Ryan wasn't just a part of her life. He was the part of her life that had been missing for so long. One evening, as they sat together on her couch, Ryan took her hand, his thumb gently brushing over her skin. "Marianne, I've been thinking about something," he said, his voice low and earnest. "What is it?" she asked, her heart quickening. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I want to be with you. I want to see where this goes, no matter what the world says. I don't want to keep this a secret, and I don't want to hide anymore." Her chest tightened as she realized what he was saying. "You're saying you want people to know about us?" Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with conviction. "I'm not ashamed of how I feel. And I don't think you should be either." Marianne felt a mix of relief and fear wash over her. This was a moment where things would either become easier or more complicated. But as she looked at Ryan, she realized something. No matter what the world might say, no matter the obstacles they might face, she wanted to be with him too. "I want that," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was racing. "I want to be open with you, with everyone. I'm tired of hiding." They leaned in then, their lips meeting in a kiss that was filled with all the unspoken promises between them. The kiss was different this time, deeper, more certain. And as they pulled away, Marian knew something had shifted within her. She wasn't just accepting this love anymore. She was embracing it fully, without fear, without hesitation. She was no longer worried about the future, because she had finally realized that love, in all its forms, wasn't about waiting for the perfect moment or the perfect circumstances. It was about living in the now. As they sat there together, their hands entwined, Marian smiled. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she was ready to face it, as long as Ryan was by her side. Weeks turned into months, and Marianne's life slowly transformed in ways she hadn't expected. The quiet, predictable days that had once defined her now felt like a distant memory. Ryan had become more than a part of her life. He was her heart's rhythm, her constant in a world that had once felt overwhelmingly solitary. Their relationship, though still met with occasional raised eyebrows from acquaintances and the quiet whispers of society, had become something they were both proud of. They no longer hid away in the shadows, afraid of what others might think. Instead, they embraced the moments they shared with an openness that felt both liberating and deeply real. One Sunday afternoon, Marianne and Ryan sat in the small cafe near the park where they often walked, sipping coffee and talking about their plans. The conversation was light, but there was an underlying sense of comfort that had settled between them. It was the kind of peace that comes from truly knowing someone, no pretenses, no games. Marianne watched him, his hands animated as he talked about a project at work. She couldn't help but smile as she saw the sparkle in his eyes, the passion with which he spoke. It reminded her of the first time they'd met, how his energy had sparked something in her that had lain dormant for far too long. As their conversation slowed, Marianne found herself lost in thought, reflecting on the journey they had taken together. She had spent so many years holding herself back, afraid of opening her heart to someone again. But now, as she looked at Ryan, she realized how much she had gained by allowing herself to love without barriers. "I'm glad we found each other," Ryan said suddenly, his voice breaking through her reverie. Her heart fluttered, and she reached for his hand across the table. "I am too. I never thought it would happen like this, but I wouldn't change a thing." Ryan squeezed her hand gently, his smile warm. "You know, I've learned a lot since we've been together. It's funny how love works, isn't it? It doesn't always follow the rules people set out, but it's real. And that's what matters." Marianne's eyes softened and she nodded. "I've learned that too. That love doesn't need anyone's permission to be real. It just is." They sat in silence for a moment, simply enjoying the presence of the other, the peacefulness of knowing they had built something genuine. As the seasons shifted, Marianne found herself embracing new aspects of her life she hadn't expected to rediscover. She began to travel more with Ryan, to meet new people, to let herself explore parts of the world that had always felt out of reach. But the greatest journey of all had been the one she had taken within herself. In the quiet moments before sleep, Marianne would reflect on the woman she had become since meeting Ryan. She wasn't the same woman who had wandered the grocery store aisles in search of ordinary tasks to fill her time. She wasn't the woman who had spent years closing herself off from love, afraid of vulnerability, afraid of rejection. No, she was stronger now, stronger because she had allowed herself to be loved, despite the odds, despite the doubts. As she lay beside Ryan one evening, his arm draped over her waist, Marianne whispered into the darkness, "I never knew love could be this freeing." Ryan's voice was sleepy but full of affection. "It's only going to get better." Marianne smiled, her heart full, because for the first time in years, she truly believed it. Love, she now knew, had no expiration date. It wasn't bound by age or societal expectations. It was something timeless, something that could blossom at any stage of life, just when you least expected it. And as she drifted off to sleep in his arms, Marianne realized that it was only the beginning of a new chapter, one that was full of promise and love, unrestrained by the past.